The Intelligence Office from Mosses from an Old Manse by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wayne Cook. Gray figure with a pair of mysterious spectacles on his nose and a pen behind his ear was seated at a desk in the corner of a metropolitan office. The apartment was fitted up with a calendar and furnished with an oaken cabinet and a chair or two in simple and businesslike style. Round the walls were stuck advertisements of articles lost or articles wanted or articles to be disposed of, in one way or another of which classes were comprehended nearly all the conveniences or otherwise that the imagination of man has contrived. The interior of the room was thrown into shadow, partly by the tall edifices that rose on the opposite side of the street, and partly by the immense show bills of blue and crimson paper that were expanded over each of the three windows. Undisturbed by the tramp of feet, the rattle of wheels, the hump of voices, the shout of the city crier, the scream of the newsboys, and other tokens of the multitudinous life that surged along in front of the office, the figure at the desk pored diligently over a folio volume of ledger-like size and aspect. He looked like the spirit of a record, the soul of his own great volume made visible in mortal shape. But scarcely an instant elapsed without the appearance at the door of some individual from the busy population whose vicinity was manifested by so much buzz and clatter and outcry. Now it was a thriving mechanic in quest of a tenement that should come within his moderate means of rent, now a ruddy Irish girl from the banks of Killarney, wandering from kitchen to kitchen of our land, while her heart still hung in the peat smoke of her native cottage. Now a single gentleman, looking out for economical board. And now, for this establishment offered an epitome of worldly pursuits, it was a faded beauty inquiring for a lost bloom, or Peter Shermill for his lost shadow, or an author of 10 years' standing for his vanished reputation, or a moody man for yesterday's sunshine. At the next lifting of the latch there entered a person with his hat awry upon his head, his clothes perversely ill-suited to his form, his eyes staring in directions opposite to their intelligence, and a certain odd unsuitableness pervading his whole figure. Wherever he might chance to be, whether in palace or cottage, church or market, on land or sea, or even at his own fireside, he must have worn the characteristic expression of a man out of his right place. This, he inquired, putting his question in the form of an assertion, this is the Central Intelligence Office. Even so, answered the figure at the desk, turning another leaf in his volume. He then looked the applicant in the face and said briefly, "Your business?" "I want," said the latter with tremulous earnestness, "a place." "A place? And of what nature?" asked the intelligencer. "There are many vacant, or soon to be so, some of which will probably suit, since they range from that of a footman, up to a seat at the council board, or in the cabinet, or a throne, or a presidential chair." The stranger stood pondering before the desk with an unquiet, dissatisfied air, a dull, vague pain of heart, expressed by a slight contortion of the brow, an earnestness of glance that asked and expected, yet continually wavered, as if distrusting. In short, he evidently wanted, not in a physical or intellectual sense, but with an urgent moral necessity that is the hardest of all things to satisfy, since it knows not its own object. "Ah, you mistake me," he said at length, with a gesture of nervous impatience. "Either of the places you mention indeed might answer my purpose, or, more probably, none of them. I want my place. My own place, my true place in the world, my proper sphere, my thing to do, which nature intended me to perform when she fashioned me thus awry, and which I have vainly sought all my lifetime. Whether it be a footman's duty or a king's, is of little consequence, so it be naturally mine. Can you help me here?" "I will enter your application," answered the intelligencer, at the same time writing a few lines in his volume. "But to undertake such a business, I tell you frankly, it's quite apart from the ground covered by my official duties. Ask for something specific, and it may doubtless be negotiated for you on your compliance with the conditions. But were I to go further, I should have the whole population of the city upon my shoulders, since far the greater proportion of them are, more or less, in your predicament." The applicant sank into a fit of despondency and passed out of the door without again lifting his eyes. And if he died of the disappointment, he was probably buried in the wrong tomb, inasmuch as the fatality of such people never deserts them, and whether alive or dead, they are invariably out of place. Almost immediately another foot was heard on the threshold. A youth entered hastily and threw a glance around the office to ascertain whether the man of intelligence was alone. Then he approached close to the desk, blushed like a maiden, and seemed at a loss how to broach his business. "You come upon an affair of the heart," said the official personage, looking into him through his mysterious spectacles. "State it in as few words as may be." "You are right," replied the youth. "I have a heart to dispose of." "You seek an exchange?" said the intelligencer. "Foolish youth, why not be contented with your own?" "Because," exclaimed the young man, losing his embarrassment in a passionate glow, "because my heart burns me with an intolerable fire. It tortures me all day long with yearnings for I know not what, and feverish throbbings and pangs of a vague sorrow. And it awakens me in the nighttime with a quake when there is nothing to be feared. I cannot endure it any longer. It were wiser to throw away such a heart, even if it brings me nothing in return." "Oh, very well," said the man of the office, making an entry in his volume. "Your affair will be easily transacted. This species of brokerage makes no inconsiderable part of my business, and there is always a large assortment of the article to select from. Here, if I mistake not, comes a pretty fair sample." Even as he spoke, the door was gently and slowly thrust ajar, affording a glimpse of the slender figure of a young girl, who, as she timidly entered, seemed to bring the light and cheerfulness of the outer atmosphere into the somewhat gloomy apartment. We know not her errand there, nor can we reveal whether the young man gave up his heart into her custody. If so, the arrangement was neither better nor worse than 99 cases out of 100, whether the parallel sensibilities of a similar age, importunate affections, and the ease of satisfaction of characters not deeply conscious of themselves supply the place of any profounder sympathy. Not always, however, was the agency of the passions and affections an office of so little trouble. It happened rarely indeed in proportion to the cases that came under an ordinary rule, but still it did happen that a heart was occasionally brought hither of such exquisite material, so delicately attempered, and so curiously wrought, that no other heart could be found to match it. It might always be considered a misfortune, in a worldly point of view, to be the possessor of such a diamond of the purest water, since in any reasonable probability it could only be exchanged for an ordinary pebble or a bit of cunningly manufactured glass, or at least for a jewel of native richness, but ill set, or with some fatal flaw, or an earthy vein running through its central luster. To choose another figure, it is sad that hearts which have their wellspring in the infinite and contain inexhaustible sympathies should ever be doomed to pour themselves into shallow vessels, and thus lavish their rich affections on the ground. Strange that the finer and deeper nature, whether in man or woman, while possessed of every other delicate instinct, should so often lack that most invaluable one of preserving itself front contamination with what is of a baser kind. Sometimes, it is true, the spiritual foundation is kept pure by a wisdom within itself, and sparkles into the light of heaven without a strain from the earthly strata through which it had gushed upward. And sometimes, even here on earth, the pure mingles with the pure, and the inexhaustible is recompensed with the infinite. But these miracles, though he should claim the credit of them, are far beyond the scope of such a superficial agent in human affairs as the figure in the mysterious spectacles. Again the door was opened, admitting the bustle of the city with a fresher reverberation into the intelligence office. Now entered a man of woebegone and downcast look. It was such an aspect that if he had lost the very soul out of his body, and had traversed all the world over, searching in the dust of the highways, and along the shady footpaths, and beneath the leaves of the forest, and among the sands of the seashore, in hopes to recover it again. He had bent an anxious glance along the pavement of the street as he came hitherward. He looked also in the angle of the doorstep, and upon the floor of the room. And finally, coming up to the man of intelligence, he gazed through the inscrutable spectacles which the latter wore, as if the lost treasure might be hidden within his eyes. "I have lost a precious jewel," replied the unfortunate person, "the like of which is not to be found among any prince's treasures. While I possessed it, the contemplation of it was my sole and sufficient happiness. No price should have purchased it of me, but it has fallen from my bosom where I wore it in my careless wanderings about the city." After causing the stranger to describe the marks of his lost jewel, the intelligencer opened a drawer of the oaken cabinet which had been mentioned as forming a part of the furniture of the room. Here were deposited whatever articles had been picked up in the streets until the right owner should claim them. It was a strange and heterogeneous collection. Not the least remarkable part of it was a great number of wedding rings, each one of which had been riveted upon the finger with holy vows, and all the misty potency that the most solemn rites could attain, but had, nevertheless, proved too slippery for the wearer's diligence. The gold of some was worn thin, betokening the attrition of years of wedlock. Others, glittering from the jeweler's shop, must have been lost within the honeymoon. There were ivory tablets, the leaves scribbled over with sentiments that had been the deepest truths of the writer's earlier years, but which were now quite obliterated from his memory. So scrupulously were articles preserved in this depository that not even withered flowers were ejected. White roses and blush roses and moss roses, fit emblems of virgin purity and shamefacedness, which had been lost or flung away and trampled into the pollution of the streets. Locks of hair, the golden and the glossy dark, the long tresses of women and the crisp curls of man, signified that lovers were now and then so heedless of the faith entrusted to them as to drop its symbol from the treasure place of the bosom. Many of these things were imbued with perfumes, and perhaps a sweet scent had departed from the lives of their former possessors ever since they had so willfully, negligently lost them. Here were gold pencil cases, little ruby hearts with golden arrows through them, bosom pins, pieces of coin,